Okay. I'm going to just say that. So that at the beginning of this recording, that we get in these good conversations, and then I realized that, oh, I should probably be recording this. And so if you're watching this after the fact, I'm sorry that you missed out on our little conversation about. Well, I can summarize. We talked about Lent and Ash Wednesday and how important they are, and Maundy, Thursday, and some of these kind of parallels, and the highs and lows in the church year, from sort of superficial, just enjoying your life, which I think is Christmas and Easter, to digging in and being contemplative and thinking and feeling deep about your faith, which to me are Lent and Advent. So we said more than that, but that's a summary. We are in chapter 4 of Mark. In verse 21 is where we are. And I believe, well, anyway, there's a bunch of teaching here right now. So he said to them, is a lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed and not on the lampstand? For there is nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. And he said to them, pay attention to what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given you. For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away.
Good. If you have more, you're going to be given more. And if you have nothing, what you have is going to go away.
I don't like that.
I don't either.
And I don't, I got to look and see. If there's
that part, I think of the song, This Little Light of Mine. And then as you go in, it gets dark in the chapter or in the story.
Well, so in Matthew, this is paired a little bit differently. It is paired with the city on a hill. A city on a hill cannot be hid, and the salt, right? And the light part is a little bit expanded compared to here in Mark. And all of those have to do with being visible and present, right? And I'm not sure that Mark's goal is that. It's the same goal with talking about light. It's similar, but it's more about, you notice that he really focuses on that which is hidden will be disclosed, secrets will be let out. That's not where exactly the same as Matthew's focus, which is on essentially the same passage. So it's sort of interesting how they take this idea of light and use it in different ways, right? Because as I said before, Matthew is looking at this passage and using this passage when he writes his book, right? And so when Matthew sees this passage about light, and he says, this idea of light is about being a guide to people in their difficult times, right? Being there for people, shining out the love of God and our faith. Mark's is a little different if you read it. It's about you can't hide things from God. You can't keep secrets from God. That's a different kind of an idea of how we talk about light. And it's interesting because this is the passage that Matthew uses. And so he uses a very different idea of what we mean by light, right? By what Jesus is saying. It's like you have, and that happens a few other places where you have the same passage in those three gospels. Sometimes the message is similar or identical, but sometimes the message is, the more you read it, the more it's sort of a different feeling, right? And I that second part, I feel like, well, especially verse, I guess 24 and 25, I can't think that has to do with people and their and their wealth or their, well-being, because that would contradict everything that Jesus says everywhere else.
Yeah.
So it's got to be related to something else. And because it's in this passage, connected with this passage here, I wonder if it has to do with how we hoard things like secrets from the world, right? How we hoard, how we keep ourselves from being open. It just is interesting. And I don't, my Bible doesn't really, Nancy's Bible always has something more to say about it. I should ask Nancy. Mine says almost nothing for verse 27 or 25,
Yeah.
25.
Mine doesn't say anything about it, but the wording is different. So we're starting at verse 24. It says, think carefully about what you hear. The way you give to others is the way God will give to you, but God will give you even more. Those who have understanding will be given more, but those who do not have understanding, even what they have will be taken away from them.
Understanding.
Right.
That's so much better a word.
Well, and my book says, and it was kind of interesting, it's pretty much the same wording, but it says, the more we appropriate truth now, the more we will receive in the future. And if we do not respond to what little truth we may know already, we will not profit even from that. So if we understand, the understanding, the truth that he is trying to tell us in the light, then we're not going to get any more later.
Gosh, isn't this a great lesson for today, right? When we talk about fake news and what's true and all that kind of stuff. Well, I read a lot, and I've had people say, "Oh, you read like the Bible every day." Well, yeah, I read the Bible every day. Oh, well, you read spiritual texts. I'm like, well, I mean, I read those too. But really, probably 3/4 of my reading is just fun reading of whatever, a lot of fiction, science fiction. Sometimes I'll read historical things, like if you've been to my house, I have a lot of books. I have a lot of books. And so I read quite a bit every day. And you think, well, how would reading a science fiction book inform me as a pastor in my sermons? I was like, it all informs me. I may not preach about some science fiction book I'm reading, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't inform me, right? It doesn't affect my ability to preach and have the Spirit work on me in some way. So I love that idea of understanding and truth. It sort of opens up the more you read, the more you open your mind to more sources of information and more literature.
Yeah.
The more.
Well, Pastor, I compare it to the people that they go to church, maybe they've even joined the church, they have a belief system, but they never dig deeply into it to learn what it's all about. Like Alexander Pope said, what was that poem about? A little learning's a dangerous thing. Either drink deeply of the Pierian spring. I can't remember it exactly.
Yeah.
He warned people. He said, go for it.
Yeah.
Deeply. The more that you learn, the better off you are in your whole life. And I feel like that shallow, well, somebody called it cheap grace.
Mm-hmm. Luther did.
Yeah. Cheap grace. And anyhow, if you just go through the motions of membership and all, and never really study it, get into the Bible or learn about the history of the church, what good's your faith going to do you?
But I get, you're right. My point is, it doesn't just have to be the spiritual stuff. I think a lot of things can sort of expand our connection with God in ways we don't always understand maybe at first. I'm going to give I wouldn't say political, not really political comparison, but I have people in town here who are very much anti-mask people. And if there's 100 pieces of information about the efficacy, the usefulness of masks, they will find the only one out of those 100 that says masks don't work. And the other 99 they'll ignore.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's kind of the opposite of what's going on right here. It's like, no, you don't read all the information to find the one that agrees with you. You read all the information and take all the pieces and make a judgment call from there.
I wear my mask that says science is real
yeah,
when I go out in public. For
but
if
that
I
happens
can't-
with a lot of things, right? People,
Mhm.
it happens with the Bible, right? People try to find that one piece of information that agrees with them, and they don't look at the bigger picture, at all of
Mhm.
it's dangerous even with the Bible. Well, see, it says in the Bible that you should do this. Yeah, but did you read the other 45 passages that say, hey, be careful about that thing, right? Don't do that, what you're
Yeah.
doing.
It also says in the Bible that a husband can divorce his wife, but a wife can't divorce her husband.
Oh yeah, I mean, we could talk all day about how you could use the Bible as a tool like that. I mean, the ones I like to use are the laws in Deuteronomy and around there about, well, the obvious ones like Jesus talks about the Sabbath day, and we've talked about that here in the Bible study, but not wearing mixed fabrics,
Yeah.
Mhm.
dietary laws like not eating pork or shellfish. And some people still take those seriously now, but they don't take all of them seriously, right? They sort of pick and choose. And I think we all, everyone, no matter how liberal, progressive, how conservative you are with reading the Bible, you all pick and choose. But it serves everyone more to have to expand your understanding of using your word from this passage, right? So I love that. I actually, I don't say this very often because I'm a dyed in the wool Lutheran, and we love our NRSV, but whatever translation that is, I like that better for this passage.
This is actually a youth Bible.
What does it say on the binding? Which
sorry.
version?
It says a youth Bible.
Yeah, Youth Bible, but it's usually also a specific version.
New Century Version, it says.
New Century Version. Yeah, I know that's a yeah, cool.
I found it at the Goodwill because my other Bible I left in Wisconsin, and then I decided I needed more than just the New Testament that I could find. So I got
I
this
don't know
one.
that I've read the New Century Version too often. My main go-to is NRSV, which most Lutheran churches use, and I like the NIV. And then sometimes I use the Message, which I really like. But the Message is not a translation per se. It's more of it's called a paraphrase,
Mhm.
because
Oh,
which means it's put in contemporary language, and it's sort of it goes out of its way to not be word for word, so it's a little bit different when you read it. But it's also can be really neat when you read it for that reason, right?
Yeah.
So, well, that we've only gotten 4 verses in, and we've. He also said the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. When the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle because the harvest has come. Every time I hear this passage, I think of something that I think I heard, I might have been a kid or college or something, that to this day, scientists don't really know how seeds work.
Yeah.
And you're like, what do you mean? They know how seeds work. Seeds come from plant, they put them in the ground. Like, no. They understand that part. They understand how to, I mean, obviously know how to farm, right? I mean, clearly we know that. But they don't understand how seeds know which way's up, which way's down, how to know when to root, how to root, when, like, somehow seeds know that, and it doesn't make a lot of logical sense that they would know that. And this is real basic, like, all we know is baby seeds come from adult plants, and you put them in the ground and it makes more adult plants. How the seeds actually know how to do all of that?
Mhm.
Like, that's amazing if you think about it, right?
yeah.
That same thing is true of all reproduction.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, animals have instincts
Mhm.
Yeah.
when they're born. They don't even have to be taught. And
Right.
scientists are still like, we're not totally sure how that happened. Something is built in the DNA that we don't understand that yet, which is really interesting. So I read this passage and I think of that, like, you scatter seed in the ground and the seed's going to come up.
Yep.
We don't know how, We can say
That's right.
it's God blessing us, but it's going to happen. And I think we take for granted that we just assume we know how the world works.
Mhm.
Yeah, from that passage, I remember teaching Sunday school for little kids and planting the bean seed in the cup. And then every week they would come in and see if their bean was growing because
Mhm.
they, they just
Mhm.
germinate and they sprout and off they go.
Yeah. It's I think this goes kind of what we talked about earlier too. And it goes to Lent, right? It's okay not to know,
Yeah.
right? It's okay to not,
Okay.
it's okay not to know, and it's okay to wonder. Um and yeah, and to grow. So that's kind of how I feel about this is, even though we don't know, the earth still produces and life still goes on and we're still cared for,
Mhm.
which is such a blessing.
God is still watching over us. I just saw this online this morning. There's a plant that's actually developed the ability to absorb road exhaust, and it grows in the ditches.
Wow.
Absorb what?
There's a plant that has evolved to absorb road exhaust. So
road
it
exhaust.
grows
So,
along the highways.
Huh.
Well, and then I'm gonna go down a tangent that I already know is going to be trouble. Um, there's some evidence that plants have I don't know, feelings. They don't have nerve endings or whatever, but but plants have some level of sense of loss, and and really kind of interesting stuff. And just the last like 2 days, I just happened to watch a video of someone cuddling a cow, and the cow was seeking comfort from them. And another story I read about a guy who developed a friendship with an octopus, and then the octopus would sort of have this friendship with him. Now, you could take that to a certain extreme and say, well, that means I'm never going to have any beef, and I'm never going to have I'm never going to have calamari, and oh, why plants too? So I can't eat any plant food, anything that comes from plants. So I literally can't eat. That's a large portion of the people that I know that are vegan or vegetarian. That's at least a very important factor. Is like, well, cows have feelings. Yeah, but if you extend, so I really believe that the Spirit of God's not sitting on a cloud somewhere. The Spirit of God is in all living things.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean we can't eat beef and we can't eat salad, but we should respect that all of those things are life itself, regardless of whether it's sentient or not. All of those things are life that God provides, and that God is in them. You're eating God, right? I mean, that sounds like a weird way to put it, but you're eating something that contains the very nature of God, of life. And so don't take it lightly, I guess.
We had a hobby farm, and my oldest, she was 10 when we moved there. She wouldn't eat the beef from the cattle that we raised. She was okay with the pork, and she was okay with store-bought meat. It was the ones that we raised at home that she didn't want to eat.
Yeah,
And it was
understand that.
if you named them, you shouldn't eat them.
Yeah. But think about this for a second. What if all life, plant and animal life, all life is sentient at some level?
Mhm. Yeah, I believe it is.
So, like this is not new science. They've determined that if you talk nice to your plants,
Yeah.
they grow better. Play music.
Succulents. I figured out my succulents grow great if I set them outside and they get the irrigation on 3 times a week, as opposed to keeping them in the house and guarding over them every day.
Yeah.
They
Talking
don't
to
like
them, playing music for them. Plants do better when you give them respect, even beyond just giving them sunlight and food and water.
Mhm.
Like, so there's something to that, but that doesn't mean, okay, now I can't eat plants or I can't eat anything, right?
You can carry it to extremes.
Right. But I think it does tell us that we can respect all life more than most of us do. Or whatever that means. I don't think we were designed not to eat meat. I've heard people say we're not designed to eat meat. I'm like, Actually, our teeth tell us that we have for millions of years been designed to eat meat. Maybe before that, but our teeth are designed to rip and tear along with,
Cow's milk.
our teeth are actually, you can look at our teeth and we know that we're designed to eat vegetables and to eat meat. So
Mhm.
whether that's evolution for millions of years or we were originally designed to be that way, that's
My fried chicken tasted very good last night for supper.
right, right. But yeah, you're going to get in trouble in front of these fine people if you stop, unless you stop bothering them.
We can't hear her, so she must not be being too bad.
She likes to jump on me when I'm on Zoom.
Yeah. Well, I tried taking the dog for a walk. We didn't get very far. It's cold outside.
Speaking of plants, we have another one here.
Mhm.
He also said, with what can you compare the kingdom of God, or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. I actually find the mustard seed parable to be, I think it's more culturally grounded in the time than we give it credit for. I've preached about, just sort of the surface level, we do have a weed and it's very prevalent around here called mustard weed.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And if you don't pay attention to mustard weed, it will take over your whole yard,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
I had
but it's
that
also
before.
interesting to talk about the difference between, I have friends in my previous call who own a nursery, and they say the only difference between a weed and a plant is a weed is a plant you don't want. Anything can be
Yeah.
a weed, and anything can be a plant, right? And that's like, we assume that, oh, it's a nuisance weed, but like there have been large periods in world history where dandelions were grown for food.
Mhm.
Well, now most people think of dandelions as being a useless weed, but whole cultures have had that as one of their primary green food source, right? So
And
you're
they're
like,
high in vitamins.
yeah.
Yeah.
So where is that? Where do we draw? Where are the plants that are useless, and where, like, I don't know that any plant is useless. That if you talk to Native Americans, they would say that. They were like, no plant is useless. Every plant has some use.
Mhm.
Right? Every going back to this conversation about life, all life is precious. All life has value, both value for themselves and value for us. And we don't use it so much as we share in the use, right? We don't abuse the resource, but it provides for us and we honor it. I'm sounding like a Sioux, like a Mescalero Apache right now. All life should be honored. But it's also this thing, obviously the other part of the mustard seed is we plant seeds knowing that they will, these little seeds that seem useless will become something bigger and become more useful to us and more valuable to us by just simply being patient, right? I guess the question I ask is, what was the mustard plant in Jesus's time? Like, is it the same plant that we think of now? Is it the mustard seed? Because the mustard weed that grows in our yard is not the same one that makes the mustard condiment, right? There's several plants that have mustard attached to them. And is it the same one that he's talking about at that time? I kind of wonder. Anyway, because I think it makes a difference knowing if that plant, how that plant grows changes how you view this parable. But sometimes we're sort of stuck with our context.
That would be interesting. I like that idea.
Yeah. With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. I have to say that in this chapter, just before we started today, what we finished last time, was one of the few times that he actually explained a parable where you could read it, the parable of the sower, and then he explains that parable. So I think it's ironic that toward the end of this chapter, in the same chapter, he says he never explained anything, but he just did, like 20 verses before, right? But it says he explained them in private to his disciples. The other thing is, some of the conversations and things that happen are privy to the disciples only anyway. So how come they didn't relay the explaining of the parables too? You know, like how come how come they only told us the parts, the parable part, and not the explanation part?
Well, why wouldn't he explain it to everybody so people could understand? Because if he just explained it to the disciples, are they supposed to, were they supposed to
Tell us.
spread the word away from him so that they could explain it later? I mean, why tell a parable if people are standing around going, duh, you know?
I mean, my interpretation of that is, the more detailed you are, the more you can sort of be pinned down on it, right? The more they can say, well, that's not true. If you tell a parable that requires some interpretation, it forces them to think about it. It forces them to, it doesn't mean, he's not trying to be, I don't think he's trying to be vague by telling parables. I think he's trying to give flexibility for the hearer to understand it for themselves.
Yeah.
But we still have to remember that very few people knew how to read and write back in those days.
Right.
Very few, like 1 in 1,000, maybe.
Yeah. And so I think that's part of it, is use your imagination, right? In a way. You know, here's the other side of it. One of the more interesting things I research I ever read when I was a teacher had to do with reading comprehension, and how it's been a couple generations now, or at least a generation, of kids not being able to visualize as well when they hear descriptions. And so make-believe is so important for reading comprehension. Hey, I'm a cop and you're a robber and this stick is my gun, or something. Or I'm a doctor and you're the patient, or whatever. To a certain degree, you have to make up, like, we're in a hospital. See, this is a hospital. It's not a dining room, right? Or whatever. And so you do this. So when I read a line in a book, and it says, I'm just going to make something up, but the old woman crossed the chasm on the rickety rope bridge. Hopefully most of us, as I'm saying that, are picturing something in our heads, right? We have a picture. If we were to be able to suddenly print that picture, it would look different from each one of us, right? But similar. An old woman, a rickety bridge, whatever that looks like for you, whatever perspective, right, you have on that. But there's a lot of kids that they don't visualize that in their head, and so it becomes sort of dead to them, because they've grown up being fed images and not exercising the muscle to build an image in their head, right? And so I think part of what's going on with these parables is he's forcing them to put an image in their head that is their own image.
Okay.
Right. And to go back to the modern example, if I read a technical, an instruction, no, not instruction book, like a technical manual on something that doesn't have anything visual, it's very dry and difficult to read, right? If it doesn't have something that I can imagine in it. Well, imagine if everything you read, even a sentence that says the old lady crossed the rickety rope bridge, if everything you read was dry like that, you couldn't visualize it because you hadn't exercised that muscle.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
not only that, but you haven't experienced enough in life to put yourself into that.
Right. So my point is that's a modern and education is shifting a little bit where they're forcing, you know, it's a fairly new, I mean, within 20 years, model for that. English classes, close your eyes and listen to this passage as I
Oh.
read, right? Imagine yourself in this, and not just in that, but in other kinds of things, in social studies. I had a good friend when I taught who tried to make everything in social studies experiential. You know, this battle was like this. We're going to sit on both sides of the classroom and imagine that they're the other side and they're this side, and what kinds of things you would hear and see. If you force people to imagine them, it develops a part of your brain that is important. And the reason I bring this up is I think that's what Jesus is doing, right? He's forcing them to imagine. He's forcing them to live into the parable rather than just to hear it.
Mhm.
Because if he explains it, he takes some of that away.
Yeah.
If he says, well, this is what that means, well, it may be what it means for, well, maybe not for Jesus, but if I say, okay, this parable, you won't hear me say this very often in sermons, right? Oh, this parable mustard seed, this is exactly what it means. It means this. And if you have a different meaning from that, you're wrong. I don't say that, do I?
No.
I say, I think this is maybe where this is going, but I don't know. Or here's one way to look at it. And so I think the parables helps us have our own take on it, and that's okay. That's a big difference between more fundamentalist churches and churches like ours. A lot of the more fundamentalist churches will say, there's only one way to view this, right? There's only one way to read this. And whereas I'm not picking on you, Colita, I promise. And as soon as I said that, she kind of was like, because the Southern Baptist Church does that a lot. Like there's only one way to read this. And I think there's evidence that Jesus didn't believe that. Jesus didn't say there's only one way to say that. It's like, look at this parable. Now think about it, have it take root in you, right? Like these plants are talking about. Have it take root in you. And your experience is going to be naturally be different from someone else's who's going to hear the same parable. Because our context is important. The context of the preacher is different from the context of a listener. So I can't tell you how many times I preached a sermon and you know, that main point that I was really, really trying to drive home was like, I said that same point like 4 times and I really hammered, like, this is the thing. And someone comes up to me and says, I love what you said about blank, which wasn't anywhere near the point of the sermon.
Yeah.
And I never have ever said, oh, that's not the intended message. Because, hey, maybe you needed to hear something different from what someone else needed to hear. That, to me, that's how the Spirit works, right? If we're all stuck on, everyone's got to have the same understanding, the same experience, we're neglecting that we all, like you said, come from different backgrounds. We have different contexts. We grew up differently. We've had different experiences. There's no such thing as a homogeneous one way of looking at anything. Right. Not to say I'm not just saying this for Colita's sake, for the record. But I have very good friends who are Southern Baptists, and I used to attend their church on occasion. There are things that they do with regards to study the Bible that are really, really excellent that I wish we did better. In some ways, they dig a lot deeper into the text than we tend to do, and so this is going to sound a little weird. Some of the way I lead this Bible study is informed by that Southern Baptist way of looking at Scripture, because they can take 2 verses and spend an hour on it, right? And I actually kind of like that. Where we tend to, Lutherans and some of the other mainline denominations tend to read on a superficial level and say, we're just going to read this and see how this applies to us and not think about all the greater context, right? So while they tend to say, dig deep, but then once they dig deep, they say, this is the message that you have to believe, which I disagree with. At least they're digging deeper than we often will dig. So there's sort of a give and take there too.
Mhm.
I did have someone say something very offensive to me that went to a much more conservative seminary in Denver. He said, well, we're more Bible, we care about the Bible and you guys don't. That's the difference between our seminary and your seminary. And I'm like,
Wow. No, never.
it's not, I mean, 3/4 of my seminary classes were Bible classes, right? We're reading, like, it's not that we don't love the Bible, it's that we understand that it is open to interpretation. It is open to context, right? So yeah, I had someone actually say that. I was like, well, the difference between us is that we care about the Bible and you don't, or something like that. I'm like,
Whoa.
huh, wow. Or we study the Bible and you don't, or whatever. It was that kind of a concept, and I'm like, wow, okay.
Sounds like somebody that had never been to a different church or been into a group where people had different views and values.
Right. Well, it also didn't help that but in Denver, there are two seminaries. There's Denver Seminary, which is very conservative, and Iliff, which is very liberal. And, like a quarter of the students at Iliff are LGBTQ. And there's a bunch of people that are there primarily not to be pastors, but to be active in social justice areas and stuff like that. So that rankled a lot of people at the other seminary, right?
I suppose.
Well, they're missing the point of you got to be a church person, and like some of the best pastors I know don't have churches. And I mean ordained pastors even, right? Some of the best pastors I know a pastor that runs a brewery and has never been a part of a church, but has a degree in theology. And gosh, that brewery gives all the proceeds to all charities every month, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Jesus stills a storm. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across the other side. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushions. And they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?
First, they want to know why didn't he care, and then they want to know what just happened.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot to that. He was sleeping through the storm just fine.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm on a boat and the captain seems calm, regardless of the weather, I'm going to be calm. Right. But I said this a lot. Notice earlier, the end of last chapter, but also through this chapter, it's the crowds are all around him, right? And I think a big part of it is he's trying to leave the crowd behind and is trying to get some rest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that he cares about them perishing. He does care about them, but he's doing a little self-care. It's only ever happened once, thankfully, and it wasn't this church, but on my day off, I had one person call me on my day off and say, and need something. I'm like, what? I kind of hinted, well, like, I will help, but this is not an emergency. And I'm like, well, this is kind of my day off. Like, aren't you supposed to help your parishioners even when it's their day off, even when it's your day off? And I'm like, I mean, could this wait till tomorrow? Right? Like I'm allowed to have self-care, and I think that's part of what's going on with Jesus is he's just trying to take care of himself a little bit.
I find it kind of odd that most of these people, or at least some of them, were fishermen, and they should be used to this all the time. So
Yeah.
why the big alarm?
Yeah. Well, they should know how to handle it.
Exactly.
Although if you've ever been in a small boat out on a lake, when the wind picks up, it is totally freaky, you know, and I can kind of sympathize with them there, because there have been times when we thought,
Mhm.
well, I guess one of us is going to make it back, but I don't know, you know.
Well, and you like you hear about people lost at sea and things like that, and you know, I can't tell you how many times I went deep sea fishing and when I lived in Florida for 14 years, and you don't realize it, but you only have to be about 10 miles off the coast to not know where the coast is, to not see it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think too, Pastor, that a lot of people do not realize the geography of the Lake of Galilee.
It's big. It's a
It
big
is
lake.
not only big, but those are steep mountains around, and those storms can just come and go into the blink of an eye, according to what I've read about the
Yeah.
geography of that lake.
Yeah. I've heard
And I
that.
think we need to read all about the geography of these places as much as we do about the people and the historical events.
Absolutely. Well, that's and that's, I mean, I think that's the job of the reader, and that's definitely the job of the preacher. You know, when I preach on something, I always read what comes before and what comes after. I try to consider who else is around, what the context of the time and the place is.
Yeah.
I try to think about all those things. That's actually some of the harder research. You just read the passage. I never preach on just the passage. You have to have all that other stuff. You have to dig into that stuff. Well, where is he? You know, what time of year is it? What time of day is it? Who's there? Who's not there?
Mm-hmm.
It's those questions that, and if I have to do that for a sermon, we should do that when we're just reading the gospel, the any scripture, right? So I'm going to give a little preface. We're going to start into chapter 5, but I'm going to give a little preface first. 2 of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. Not so much because they're necessarily life-giving, but just they're very interesting stories. Are from Mark and from this next chapter. So specifically in Mark, these stories also exist in Luke and Matthew. But because Mark is the earlier source and probably the more original source for these stories, and because both of these stories in chapter 5, I guess what intrigues me about both of them more is that compared to a lot of stories in the entire Gospel of Mark, these 2 pose a lot of questions for me personally that I don't necessarily have answers for. And so the single biggest paper I wrote in all of seminary was on the second half of the second story here in chapter 5. And probably the longest paper I wrote. I think the longest paper I wrote. And the first story I have about 1 million questions. I wrote some of you know about the book that I edited, and I wrote. One of the short stories I wrote was about this Gerasene demoniac and all the questions that come up when I read it. So we'll at least read that. We've got about 10 minutes. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. By the way, this is related, but it's probably a bad translation. There was a town called Gadara that was in this area, so it probably would have been Gadarenes. It might say that in your Bible. I assume it does. So they often say Gadara or Gergasa, but Gerasenes is probably a bad translation along the way. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with them. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. I love it, but I have so many questions. Sorry. That's my mother, and I'm going to call her back later, I promise. He says to 5 mothers. I'm just going to say what I said before. For this passage, I have more questions than answers when I read this. There's so many. When we talked earlier about the cultural connections and things like that, there's so many interesting cultural connections here. Like, who was this guy? Where did he come from? What's his name?
Yeah. And what friends could he have?
How could he possibly have friends if he's been living in the tombs for years? Yeah. And the townspeople came and they were afraid of him because he had been, tortured. He couldn't be in regular normal society for years, we assume, right? So no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. Well, clearly they tried to restrain him. So how could he go back to this tent? Like, where would he go? Who does he belong to? Like, where, go tell people about, but not the people that you just along who you live, because they don't trust you. They don't like. And the pigs thing, one of the most interesting things that I think I've learned fairly recently, at least since seminary, is that we just talked about this. Jews don't eat pig.
No, they don't.
And granted, you're in an area that's probably not majority Jewish, so it could be that. But I've heard this conjecture, which I think is really interesting. It was that 2,000 pigs was probably the bulk of that meat was for the Romans, was being raised for the Romans. So in a way, it's an act of rebellion against Rome by having 2,000 pigs drowned.
Yeah.
You're cutting off a major 2,000 pigs. That's a lot of food. Cutting off 2,000 pigs from Romans being able to eat them. That's a big deal. So that's one that you don't see when you read this on the surface. But if you realize, well, wait a second, who's eating that much pig, right? Why would they need that much pig? Even the non-Jewish lands around there, the Samaritans and things like that, they had a lot of cultural connections with the Jews. I don't know whether they followed all of those dietary laws or not, but some of them did. So it's possible that they didn't eat pork either. I don't know that for sure. I'd have to look it up. But that makes it even more interesting, right? Yeah, this has a lot. I mean, like I said, there's also the end of it, right? He heals this man, and the people are so afraid or so mad at him for taking away part of their livelihood, they tell him to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Could they have used them for trade or barter?
The pigs? I assume. You understand that a monetary system like we have is fairly new and new within the last 300 or 400 years. That prior to that, it was always based on weight of a precious metal or trade.
Mhm.
Even when there was paper currency was guaranteed by a certain weight of a precious metal, which our system isn't, which is really interesting. It's
Ours was once upon a time.
yep.
Yeah.
It's not to say that it's not guaranteed, but it's not guaranteed the same way, right? You can't say a $20 bill will always get you X amount of silver, regardless of how the price of silver goes up or down. They do. By the way, there are such things. Have you ever heard of a silver certificate?
Mhm.
They still print silver certificates, which are so a $20 bill could be worth more than $20 worth of silver, depending on the price of silver. It's when it was purchased, it was worth $20 of silver. But if the silver price goes up, that silver certificate is worth more or less, which is kind of interesting, right? It's not actually $20. But so going back to the thing, yeah, who knows if they're raising them to sell them to the Romans or to trade them or whatever. But that many pigs probably, I mean, that's a lot. Probably the Romans had something to do with it.
Yeah, it ruined someone's big business.
Right. And that's not the only time that happened. You think about it, how much, interesting, I didn't plan on going this tangent, but part of my sermon last night had to do with how Lent and Ash Wednesday is a disruption. It's an imposition, right? And how often was Jesus's ministry, sometimes the teaching, but oftentimes the healing and stuff, an interruption, a disruption into people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people took that positively and sometimes they took it negatively. Right? That it not just this, but other places where even though Jesus didn't mean to cause harm, sometimes his positive things was a disruption to people's livelihoods or people's lives, right? And how they react to that says a lot about them. Like these people, I understand they're upset. That's a lot of livelihood lost.
Mm-hmm.
2,000 pigs, but also this man who's been tormenting them to some level, or they wouldn't have had to put him in chains, is healed. Right? It's almost like sometimes there's a give and a take with Jesus. Sometimes you have to take the good with the bad. And I'm not saying there's bad with Jesus, but there's the counter effect sometimes. But somebody asked me once, what about, so when Matthew stopped being a tax collector, did he still collect taxes while he was Jesus' apostle? Well, we don't know. My picture is he doesn't. He stops being a tax collector once he becomes a disciple. We don't know, but it seem sort of weird? Like either if he does totally stop, then now the taxes have to be collected by someone else. Someone else has to be hired and trained and right? All that stuff. Or a worst case scenario, he continues to collect taxes as a sort of side livelihood while he's still a disciple, which doesn't seem likely, but we don't, either one is sort of a disruption, right? Either
Taxes and do it properly, rather than weren't the tax collectors also thieves?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Maybe he collected taxes and he did it honestly after that point.
Yeah.
We don't know, but my point is, either way, whether he stopped collecting taxes totally, or he changed the way he's collecting taxes, or whatever, there was a disruption that went beyond Jesus's calling the disciple, or Jesus' teaching, or Jesus' healing, whatever. That sometimes there's this disruption that we have to take that bigger context and go, oh, right, yeah. And not just the obvious ones like the turning over the tables in the temple. I mean, there's other ones too where we go, oh, right. This is clearly, I mean, of all the stories in the Bible, this is a pretty big, this one with the Gerasene demoniac is a pretty major disruption on multiple levels, right? This guy who has been a disruption is suddenly not.
Mm-hmm.
This huge herd of pigs being destroyed essentially is a major disruption, probably to lots of people, not just to the people that own the pigs, but the people that were depending on it for food and people that were providing food for the pigs to eat, to grow. I mean, like how many industries were affected by this one act, right? I'm not trying to make Jesus look like the bad guy, but I think sometimes we just sort of write those things off. It's like, well, he's healed, so good. So that's the only thing that comes out of this. And actually, there's a lot of side stories here.
One thing that I thought was interesting is that then he says to go home and tell everybody about it. Now, we had talked about that earlier, but in my Bible, it mentions that this is mostly a Gentile area. So
Yeah.
if he told him to go back to where he was from and tell people that he had been healed, these Gentiles would not know that he was the Messiah, and they could pass the word, and they could actually, convert some people, or at least let them know what's going on without being in fear of being branded the Messiah too soon.
I think you hit on something. So I've said this many times, and I jokingly say, I mean, maybe someday I'll get my doctorate, but one of the things I find most interesting in the Gospels is when Jesus says, "Go and tell everybody," and then "Don't tell anybody."
Yeah.
And why? Like, what's the motivation? Like, what's the context, and what's the difference between those times he says, "Don't tell anybody," versus when he says, "Go tell everybody"? And we're going to see it. So yeah, I kind of mentioned that this is especially being on the other side of the lake. Anything on the other side of the lake is Gentile territory. Like I said, they may be culturally way back generations and generations Jewish, but they're not Jewish. It's Gentile land. But there are times that he's in Gentile lands, he says, "Don't tell anybody" too. So it's in fact, we're a little over 11, so I'm gonna end here. But the next passage, which is in the same region, right? Well, it says he goes to the other side of the boat, other side of the lake, so maybe not, but it's still probably a largely Gentile area at least. He does. There are two parts of that. First, he heals a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, and he does it very publicly and doesn't say anything about "Don't tell anybody." And then he heals the daughter of a leader in the synagogue and says, "Don't tell anybody." So we have in one chapter, tell everybody, don't tell everybody. And I would find it really interesting to study personally the difference in the context between the times he says tell everybody and the times he says don't tell everybody. And why does he say one and not the other, depending on where, what the context of the situation is. Part of my paper on the second half of this chapter that we'll start next week, I make sort of some judgments on that. Why say tell everybody here, and why is it public here and not public there? And what does that mean for his message? His branding. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but I think we always have to read the Gospels with understanding of Jesus's branding, his marketing. Sometimes he wants to market himself, like in this story, right? In this story we just read. Tell everybody about me. He says, "Hey, go put out some ads," right? I mean, I know that's a modern way of thinking about it, but take out an ad saying, "Look how cool Jesus is," right? But the other time he says, "Shh, don't tell anybody." And I think there's got to be some significance. I'm just guessing, but I bet in Mark there's 15 to 20 times he says one or the other. Tell everybody, don't tell anybody. If you were to take those passages and look at them side by side, can you see a thread between the times he says don't tell and the times he says tell everybody? I just find that interesting, right? Because we're going to see that if we read this whole chapter at once, you'll see that he goes out of his way to say, "Here, tell everybody." Is it because he's totally in a Gentile land? He's trying to, well, see, now that just saying what I'm about to say is controversial to some people, because I'm really not a fan of what we call chosen people language. So, but there's some evidence that Jesus sometimes is more focused on the Jewish people than on the Gentiles, at least early on in his ministry. But here he's saying, tell all the Gentiles about me, which would throw that whole theory up in the air, right? Well, wait a second. I thought you were more worried about the Jews, but here you're telling a whole bunch of non-Jews to tell everybody about him. And there are times, like in the temple at the end of this chapter, where he's likely a 100% Jewish audience saying, "Don't tell everybody." But then there's times with these 100% Jewish audience that he says, "Tell everybody." So it's really, to me, it's a very interesting
Okay.
context to figure out, well, why would he say tell everybody here and don't tell everybody other places? And I'd be curious to break that down. It's hard to do it when we're reading through the Bible, but if you take those pieces out and kind of look at them on their own. Anyway, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's, as you brought up, I think it's really important to this whole story, right? Here's this guy who's probably not Jewish in a not Jewish land, in a I wouldn't say pagan. This isn't pagan and Gentile could be viewed in the same as parallels, as similar things. Usually pagan means Roman, and Gentile means not Jewish. So they're not really the same. I wouldn't say this is a Roman area, so it's not really a pagan area, but it would be a largely Gentile area, right? I won't remember to remind you, but I would say as we read the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, look for those times when he says, "Tell
Mark.
everybody." Mark, thank you. Look for those times when he says, "Tell everybody" or "Don't tell everybody." I personally think those are really intriguing passages, and it happens a lot. So, okay. We got exactly a chapter, from the middle of a chapter to the middle of a chapter.
Okay.
5:21. Yeah, I personally love passages that make me think, make me wonder. Oh, we lost somebody.
Let's call Lita. She waved to reply.
Oh, okay.
She left.
I love passages that make me go, wait a second, why is that written that way? You know, and not having the answers. We don't have an answers. We can just guess, you know, and I kind of love that. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for giving us your word. Thank you for leading us to wonder about your word for us and for people in times long past. Help us see the context both for them and for us, and how this word can be used to enrich our lives. All this in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you all very much. I know you guys aren't attending it, but I was originally going to do a 6 o'clock Bible study. Partly because I'm doing this play, I've decided to delay until the play is over, and then as soon as the play is over, I'm taking a week of vacation. So I am going to just do the 6 o'clock Bible study, but just not until the end of March, beginning of April. Probably I'll start doing the 6 o'clock also.
You did hold that a couple of times.
I did. I held it essentially 3 times. 2 times nobody showed up, and the one time that I canceled the last minute was the one time that somebody showed up.
Oh, that was the one I was going to go to.
Yeah, and Candy was going to attend that one also. Yeah, so we have rehearsals on Thursday nights, and it's okay for me to go late, but as the play opens in a week and a half, and I need to be there to get ready. So yeah. So, well, thank you all.
Oh, I was going to say, Betty Lou, it's good to see you.
Thank you.